So let us talk about accursed fallen nobles and demonic infused war machines. Time for an army overview of Chaos Knights in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Knights. As we've done with a good number of 40k factions recently, I thought we'd do a full army overview, talk about some of the strengths of the Codex, and how a strong army of them functions best in 9th edition. We'll talk about their current performance and the strengths and weaknesses of the army in general, then move through to talk about their core rules, some of the strongest rules from each of the sections, the datasheets individually, Dreadblades, allies, and some strong army lists. In any case, back to the subject in hand, and let's talk Chaos Knights in 40k. They really are an army that's only really come to the fore in the last year or so. They did have a previous codex, but it was kind of limited. It only really feels like this year that they've actually become a proper army in their own right, with an actual decent choice of units, with a nice new Abominants kit, and new War Dogs that are actually dedicated to the faction. I do quite like the 9th edition Knight codexes as well. They make them a lot more interesting and in-depth as armies, despite having relatively few models. Currently in 40k they are doing pretty well. They're sitting at around about a 48% win rate at tournaments, and they're at least a relatively widely played faction, representing around about 7% of total tournament lists. They have just had some nice new models, and they're a quite easy army to get together as they go. In Nephilim they have had a couple of big tournament wins already, but really quite a lot of podium placings on top of that. Though as with Knights in general, they can be a little bit of a skewed type list. They're all vehicles after all, and it means that they can have some bad matchups. They will pretty handily beat certain armies, but they maybe lose disproportionately against certain lists. Tyranids, Tau, Sisters, Imperial Knights, and Guard all seem to be far better against them than is standard for their armies. In general, it's basically things that are very happy dealing with very big tough vehicles, whether it's Tyranid Mortal Wounds, Melters or Repentia from Sisters, Imperial Knight Firepower, or Guard Demolisher Cannons plus Auto Wounding and their various anti-chaos options. The less said about the Tau Railgun the better. Still though, definitely an army that you can certainly win with, and a solid competitive army. For the faction strengths, the Knight datasheets are all vehicles, and it just gives them a fair amount of raw power overall, lots of firepower and combat threat, a fair bit of muscle to clear objectives with fast moving objectives secured on their war dogs, and then beyond that most of the codex is built around stacking buffs on big models, things like demonic Favours, Relics and Warlord Traits all layered up onto one unit. And some armies they can be really quite vicious against with their dread abilities, particularly enemies that have lower leadership. On the downside, as mentioned, they are a skew list basically by nature. Anything that does great against heavy tanks will chew through knights fairly well. Plus they've got a few other negatives, such as dread abilities being kind of useless against several armies. Secondaries can be a little bit challenging for them, despite at least one obvious choice that's almost auto-include. And as with knights in general, terrain tends to be an enemy, not a friend. Melee knights will have to make effort to go around it, and big knights can often be shot with enemy units that are hiding out of line of sight. Definitely an interesting army to play though, some big strengths but also some big weaknesses. Getting into their army rules though, let's start up by talking about their core rules and then move on to their dread abilities. Knights do have a whole bunch of rules that basically let an army of super heavy walkers function kind of normally in a game of 40k. First up, they aren't punished too much by their super heavy detachments. You get to refund 3 CP if there's 1 or 2 abhorrents within the detachment, or between 3 to 5 war dogs. Very nice if you're running a detachment with lots of war dogs. Or you get to refund 6 CP on a super heavy detachment if there's 3 plus abhorrents in it, or any 1 Titanic Knight and 6 or more war dogs. Generally that's pretty freeing, and that will cover the vast majority of knight lists that you might want to field. It can put them in a bit of an awkward spot just for a few specific builds though. Say for example if you wanted 2 abhorrents and 1 dominus knight, that could be kind of annoying. They also don't do amazingly well with triggering those benefits at around the 1000 to 1500 points mark, which could just be a little bit frustrating to play with. They also have decent objective rules as well. Objectives secured on their war dogs, which actually allow them to function on primary objectives, which was a massive weakness before that happened. Plus on top of that, the war dogs count as 5 models, and the big Titanic Knights count as 10. It will mean that generally the opponent actually needs to kill the models, and can't just swipe away the objective just with a casual infantryman with objective secured. As with their Imperial cousins, they get ion shields. Everyone gets a 5+ invul save at range that they can rotate for 1 or 2 CP to a 4+. It makes them a bit more resilient against high AP fire, but it does mean that they're easier to kill in combat than they are when shooting. They've got the super heavy walker rule, which means the Titanic Knights can move across things that aren't monsters or vehicles, meaning that they're a little bit harder to move block, though it sometimes still is possible if the entire base can't get to the other side of the unit. And unique to Chaos Knights, they also have the Dread Test rule, which triggers for a bunch of random rules within the Codex. It's mainly focused around the Dread abilities, but it's basically a 2d6 versus current leadership, and if you have more than it, then the Dread Test is failed, and some sort of unpleasant effect happens. Quite a nice way to actually make leadership a bit more meaningful. A lot of armies that are basically immune to taking morale casualties can still actually have effects from this. Let's talk about the Harbingers of Dread rule first then. This one's the relatively new army-wide special rule that you get if you don't take any Chaos allies besides certain allowed ones, and it basically messes with your opponent's leadership and can also give them some pretty interesting debuffs that get worse towards the end of the game. A lot of them use Dread range, which is usually 12 inches, though it can be increased, and it's basically an aura ability around all of your models that can't be turned off. Games Workshop do like their progressive turn-by-turn abilities in 9th edition, and this one is a slightly less intuitive one than some. You've got 3 columns in a table called Despair, Doom and Darkness. Each turn you get to choose one of the buffs to add to the pile to help to debuff the enemy units, but you have to do a bit of committing to one side. You start with a Doom one, and then from there you could either go to Despair or Darkness, but in future turns you can either only move back to Doom or keep the same one of those. Some of them really are quite nasty debuffs though, and they can get pretty nasty when there's multiple ones layered towards the end of the game. The table's laid out with this, with the Doom abilities down the middle, the Despair on the left and the Darkness on the right. Broadly speaking, the Doom kind of doubles down on debuffing leadership and making enemies run away a bit more. Despair messes with special rules and objectives, and Darkness has a bit of chance to actually help out with debuffing enemies' damage, either preventing charges or making you -1 to hit in range or in combat. I feel like which ones you choose exactly might depend a little bit on which army you're running and what your opponent's running. On turn 1 you get the automatic -1 leadership and -1 combat attrition when you're within dread range. It could be kind of punishing to middling to low leadership units, maybe particularly armies like orcs who already have morale issues to begin with. In general, unless it looks specifically different for the game, I think my default would be to go down the darkness line. The turn 2 one can actually genuinely mess with your opponent's decisions and what they're able to do. You need to take a dread test if you try and shoot a unit when you're within dread range. If you fail, then you must shoot the closest unit instead. And you also have to take a dread test when you're charging units. If you fail the dread test, then you halve your charging distance, which actually is genuinely pretty brutal. That's a not insignificant chance of preventing a combat provided your opponent wasn't right up next to you. And if that happens, that could save you some major damage, maybe even save a knight's life and allow you to counter-attack instead. Then the turn 3 Darkness one is a -1 to hit at greater than 12 inches. That's not dread range locks, that's just for everyone. Really nice against low ballistic skill armies or armies that are mainly ranged. And then turn 4 you get a -1 to hit in melee as well. Again, those last 2 debuffs do kind of matter whether or not your opponent's mainly ranged or mainly a combat army. There's going to be some armies that just don't really care too much about it though. Say for example Emperor's Children who just ignore modifiers. Neither of those are going to be worth taking against them. Otherwise, for the Darkness one, the turn 2 one's kind of good. An extra 3 inch to dread range means that your leadership debuffs go further. The turn 3 one makes failed morale tests actually genuinely quite punishing, losing an extra model or extra D3 if the test doubles their leadership. And then turn 4 or 5 double down on leadership modifiers. Finally, for Despair, the turn 2 one is quite disruptive. It gives you -3 inch to enemy aura abilities and command phase abilities. Could be kind of handy to mess with their positioning if there's a lot of them. The next one means that you need to take a dread test to do actions. Occasionally that's going to be very relevant, a lot of the time kind of not though. But the turn 4 one is super interesting. It basically turns off enemy obsec within dread range. That's super powerful and you don't even need to test morale or anything. It means that if you have war dogs on objectives from that point, then the objectives belong to you. In general, it's a fair amount of helpful stuff. You can also pick up an additional dread ability from the Harbingers stratagem. As I said, I think my default pick would usually be Darkness. Depending on the enemy army though, or if late game objectives are going to be a big deal, then the Doom ones and particularly the Despair Obsec debuff are both pretty cool as well. Moving on to the various rule sections of the Codex, and Knights maybe operate a little bit differently to a lot of armies in that the Warlord Traits, Relics, and the Demonic Favours basically function as almost stacking upgrades on a Knight, the command point cost basically being part of army construction and can give you some pretty meaningful damage or defensive boosts. A fair bunch of the Warlord Traits are really quite tempting. Perhaps my favourites are these ones. Infernal Quest can give you Obsec on a big Knight. Counting as 10 models, that means that the objective's almost certainly going to belong to you. Knight Diabolus gives you +1 attack and reroll hit rolls of 1 in melee. That one is a seriously potent melee buff, pretty excellent on a Rampager to be honest, or just about any of the other big knights will certainly like that quite a lot. Aura of Terror is a pretty nice debuff one. When in dread range, enemies need to take morale or dread test on 3d6 and drop the lowest. It gives you a far likelier chance of making your dread abilities meaningful, and can be pretty nice stacked on an Abominant as well with its own psychic debuff. If you want to make one knight into a dread machine, then that one is pretty cool. Otherwise, and very relevant I think, is Herpetrax's Bow to None. This one allows the knights to ignore any modifiers to hit and wound, and to advance and charge. It basically makes it into a super reliable gun and melee platform. Lots of things can give you -1 to hit, such as dense cover, and not having any movement modifiers slow it down is also pretty handy. I think all of these are pretty good. Maybe Infernal Quest and Knight Diabolus are perhaps the two easiest to use. Relics next, and most of the time the Knight ones do tend to be quite exciting, often upgraded versions of very powerful guns, or adding massive durability to very tough models already. There aren't as many relic weapons as in the Imperial Knight Codex, but one of them that's very good is the Diamonus. This one's a 3-shot laser destructor for the Desecrator, and I think that that's a very reasonable upgrade with the massive damage that it can deal. Otherwise, for Iconoclast Knights, then the Veil of Medrungard is almost auto-include territory. A 1 CP upgrade to basically give the knight a 4+ invul at range and a 6+ in melee all game long. If it even saves you from rotating ion shields once, then it will have paid for itself already. The little invul melee is quite a nice bonus on top of it. I'd definitely consider that if you are taking a big knight. The Helm of Dogs is a great one for the War Dogs. It gives you an aura of rerolls 1s to wound and +1 attack for that War Dog in particular. Maybe take it on a War Dog Stalker or something amongst a pack of other ones. It'll help them out whether they're in range or in melee. Otherwise, the Helm of Warpsight is quite nice. That one ignores hit roll modifiers and cover, so it's quite a good one for a shooty big knight. And the Panoply of Cursed Knights is a good one too. A 2+ save for a knight, probably not quite as good as the Veil overall, but still a pretty meaningful toughness boost. Depending on how many big knights you're running, I think it's almost always worth giving them a relic of some description. Then combined with the relics and the Warlord traits, you also get to give each knight a Favour of the Dark Gods if you want to. That gets them the god-specific keyword for stratagems and things, but also a big buff that gets better if you make a kill tally. Of the stratagems that they can gain access to, I feel like perhaps the single most useful one is the Undivided one that allows you a chance of resurrecting a slain knight, though the Nurgle one for fighting on full profile certainly could be handy. I feel like Games Workshop have done pretty well to make the vast majority of the table really quite usable, though I think that a few of them really do still stand out quite a bit and are far more likely to get taken. I do quite like the way that they've given them different points cost as well, depending on what class of knight you take them on. Out of the entire table, my favourite 3 I think are the Mirror of Fates, the Mark of the Dread Knight, and the Blessing of the Dark Master. The Mirror of Fates is a Tzeentch one, it's a 15-point upgrade on a War Dog, and it basically lets you farm your opponent's command points, regenerating them on a 5+ per stratagem spent. For just 15 points, I think that's pretty much guaranteed to give you enough command points that it's worth the trade-off. Put it on a backfield executioner or something like that, and just allow it to farm command points all game while chipping in firepower. Otherwise, I think that the Undivided durability ones are very nice indeed. Mark of the Dread Knight is the 6+ Feel No Pain, which is kind of borderline worth it at the 40 points already. Then when you make your kill tally, it goes up to a 5+ Feel No Pain all game long. And if you do happen to meet the tally as you go along, then I think it goes from being borderline worth it to absolutely definitely worth it, and a massive boost to the toughness of the knight. I think it's both usable on the War Dogs and any of the big knights besides the Abominant who already gets a Feel No Pain. For the Abominant though, I'd be most tempted by Blessing of the Dark Master most of the time. That's the Be'lakor style Undivided one, 30 points on an Abhorrent, and it turns off enemy rerolls when you attack it. Really quite big in 9th edition with how many rerolls tend to be going round. And again, the favoured ability is very good indeed. Hit rolls of 1 to 3 will automatically fail against it, which combos very nicely with turning off the rerolls. Another solid survivability boost, really nice for an Abominant that's already tanky with the Feel No Pain. Otherwise, I think that lots of the others are very solid as well. Warpborn Stalker can allow you to deep strike a knight, really quite a nasty disruptive threat there. The Putrid Carapace is a Nurgle one that can give you +1 saves against damage 1, but really I think the biggest thing about it is the +1 toughness if you get favoured. Having a knight go to toughness 9 is pretty big. Beguiling Majesty is a great Slaanesh one. This one gives you enormous durability in combat with a -1 to hit and wound in melee. A bit of a weird one as it doesn't make the knight any harder to kill at range, but it makes them spectacularly hard to remove in melee, so maybe good for a frontline fighter like a Rampager or a Carnivore. The Blood Shield for Khorne is also a very popular one. That gives you a single turn of ignoring invul saves, again great for a Carnivore or Rampager, and plenty of the rest of the pack remain very usable, the Pyro to make a Knight of Psyker, or the Cursed Rune of Fate to reflect some damage back at the enemy from Tzeentch. Lots of good options overall though. I feel like the table is quite a fun one to allow you to customise your knights. Moving on, and talking of psychic powers and the Abominant, here we have them. I feel like the way that psychic powers work, in general you'd want just one Abominant in an army but not more, as the first one will have basically taken the good powers, and I'm not sure there's really quite enough standout ones to really justify two. By far the best of the discipline in my opinion is Winds of the Warp, a 5+ Feel No Pain, and an aura of 6+ Feel No Pain to War Dogs if you cast it on a high number. That one's just really efficient all by itself. If you can keep that one going all game long, it'd usually give your opponent the equivalent of an extra 12 wounds worth of big knight to slog through, which is absolutely massive. Being a psychic power though, it does mean that the Abominant's a bit more vulnerable to the Alpha Strike. Ideally you don't want it taken out before it gets to put this buff up. Otherwise, I think the two really quite good ones are the Storm Malevolent. This one's a very meaty melee buff with a +1 to wound and 6s deal mortal wounds against one enemy unit to a maximum of 3. I think it combos very nicely with the Abominant's mid-strength melee attacks, and particularly in combination with the Iconoclast buff makes it a real force to be reckoned with in combat, as well as just very tanky. Otherwise though, if you did just want to focus on making your knights just super good on the dread abilities, you could maybe think about Vortex of Terrors. That one will push out to an extra -1 leadership, and can potentially make them -1 to hit when they're attacking as well. Could be fairly brutal when layered with the Warlord trait and also the dread abilities. Next up, talking about the secondaries, and for the Chaos Knights I feel like they really have one very standout faction specific one, which is Ruthless Tyranny. Knights often struggle a little bit on the secondary objectives, but this one's basically auto-include good. You can get 2 victory points per turn just by holding half or more of the objectives on the board, usually super easy to do if you've got a bunch of War Dogs about, and then an extra 1 victory point if half or more are in dread range as well, which should happen easily at the same time as when you're doing the first bit. Finally, you can also have the option to score more than 3 victory points a turn, and you get an extra one if they're all within dread range. I feel like that's not always going to happen, but it's not impossible if you've held down your own objectives and you also have some knights pushing up to assault the enemy. A very good secondary, basically hold half the board and max it out to 15 points. Otherwise, out of the unique Chaos ones, I don't think the others are that standout. I feel like both a Storm of Darkness and a Fitting Challenge are both okay picks, maybe depending on what else is available. Storm of Darkness is the one that allows you to do actions on objectives that last until your next psychic phase. You need to survive a turn of enemy retribution, and maybe it's a bit better on War Dog heavy lists as opposed to the big knights who might be giving up a bit too much not doing their movement. I feel like that's usually going to be one that you'd almost be guaranteed to score something on, but it will be a quite hard one to max. Otherwise, a Fitting Challenge allows you to try and kill the 3 biggest units as early as possible. You get diminishing rewards for killing them throughout the game. I feel like this one maybe kind of depends on exactly what units are in your opponent's army. If there's something that's just super resilient that's probably not going to die all game long, then it's a bit unlikely. If they're nasty but killable big threats that are likely going to be coming towards you, then it could actually be a fairly lucrative one. It certainly can still score pretty well, but it does give your opponent some counterplay, and is a bit risky all or nothing in some cases. Otherwise, there's Path of Destruction, trying to kill enemy units when your knights are standing in different places. It seems pretty weak to me. I'd almost certainly go grind them down on no prisoners instead of that. Grind usually isn't the hardest thing for knight lists with a few big models, and I feel like even that one, which isn't super standout, is usually going to do better than Path of Destruction. Overall though, in summary, I'd generally take Ruthless Tyranny. The other two are okay, but hopefully there's something better out of the regular ones than those. Finally, before we get onto Dread households and datasheets, there's the Stratagems. Chaos and Imperial Knights basically have quite a lot of easy ways to get a little bit more damage and defense on quite a few of their units, but given that they often want to spend at least a fair few points pre-game, it can just mean that they need to pick and choose exactly where they use those buffs. Besides ones that are very unit or war gear specific, here are just a few of the more generally useful ones in my opinion. There's a 2CP one for War Dogs getting extra hits on 6s versus one target. That's quite nice with shooty War Dog lists. You can just focus fire with a lot of shots against one unit, and that could easily be enough damage to outweigh the cost. There's a 1 or 2 CP one for -1 damage in melee. That one's quite a nice one if you happen to be attacked by a 2 damage unit like Sanguinary Guard or Sisters Repentia. Very good for War Dogs for just 1 CP that. Spiteful Demise is a helpful auto-explode one. You only get to use it once per game, and it's 2 CP for an Abhorrent, but this is one to basically always bear in mind when your knight dies, and occasionally it could actually be worth getting them in the position to die in just the right spot. Say for example, if you had a Rampager just on a couple of wounds left, charge something that's going to likely kill it, deal some damage to it, and then just make sure you're in the perfect position to go nuclear and deal d6 mortal wounds to a whole ton of units nearby. For 1 CP, Ravenous Terror Shades gives you the chance to do a mortal wounds to a unit within dread range in the morale phase. That one could be quite a nice way to just try and have a last ditch attempt to finish off an enemy unit that's going to do something important in their turn. Obviously best for targeting low leadership units, but if you did have multiple sources of -1 leadership on the unit, it could actually stack up to be a fairly decent source of mortal wounds. Diabolic Bulwark gives you a 4+ envelope range, basically rotate ion shields for the traitors. That one's a bit of a staple against anything that's high AP shooting. And finally, Doom and Despair for 2 CP is a handy one for manipulating the Harbingers of Dread table. You get another Harbinger ability from a previous round. Perhaps could be particularly nice for the Extend Dread range one if you went down the Darkness or Despair route for that particular ability. It's pretty nice in that it's army wise, but 2 CP is still a little bit on the pricey side. Overall, a fair amount of good stuff, plus some war gear specific things such as the Chain Sweep equivalent. I feel like the defensive boost and the auto explodes are maybe some of the biggest picks, though they can have very meaningful differences. Next up, we're on to the Dread households, and Chaos Knights kind of get the buffs in 2 parts. Firstly, by belonging to either Iconoclast or Infernal, and then getting the actual Dread household traits and the individual boosts that they bring. You can then also choose to be a Dreadblade as well, which does have its advantages, and trade out the Iconoclast or Infernal buff for a Fell Bond, and give you a bit more flexibility, but at the cost of some raw power potentially. Out of Iconoclast and Infernal, I feel like Iconoclast is overall a bit stronger. Chaos Knights tend to be at least fairly melee focused. Getting an extra AP and attack on the first round of combat massively improves a lot of profiles. It's going to make the Knights flatly more dangerous, and particularly against Armour of Contempt, and I feel like both buffs are particularly nice for the Abominants. On top of that, some extra options are either locked to Iconoclast or Infernal, and I feel like most of the most useful ones are the Iconoclast ones. The Veil of Medringard for its nice 4+ envelope range, a +1 to hit on the charge stratagem, which is pretty good for anything that's not already hitting on a 2. Plus I feel like the Fell Bonds for the Dreadblades within the army are also very decent as well, as we'll talk about in a second. The Infernal one is perhaps a bit more of a mixed bag. You have the option of taking mortal wounds for buffs. Either take 1 and get a random boost, or D3 and choose it. Usually taking the D3 tends to be the more useful one, as at least you can guarantee the buff that you need then. It isn't something that I'd do for every knight every round though. You're just going to do a lot more damage to your own knights than you actually get in utility, I think. But if you've got a knight that's almost guaranteed to just get focused down with heavy weapons next turn, then the transhuman rule isn't too bad. Could be worth taking the mortal wounds for that. Getting a +1 to wound boost could be quite nice to really focus down an enemy threat. Pretty good with the lower strength weapons, things like Avenger Gatling cannons or the Reaper chain cannons, and occasionally the move might be worth it. If it makes the difference between making a charge or not doing so, it could be well worth taking the D3 mortal wounds, or occasionally if it gives you the chance to get on an objective and secure yourself a few victory points. I'm maybe not quite as sold on the unique relic, but the stratagem could be okay. Bind the Souls of the Slain is quite nice for killing units in melee. If you know that you're about to kill a whole bunch of infantry, then that could be a way to regenerate some wounds. I'd say it's usable, but not stand out use every turn. Really though, you can't just decide between those two, as you also need to weigh up the households that you're taking within that, and after you've taken into account Iconoclast and Infernal and the Dread household buffs, it generally seems to be House Herbitrax that comes out on top for the Chaos Knights, and then maybe House Vextrix, which is the next most commonly played. The majority of Chaos Knight tournament lists tend to take those two, with things like Cormentis and Korvax also getting play as well. If your army at least has a reasonable amount of combat though, then Herbitrax is probably one of the single easiest ones to use. You get an extra 2 wounds per War Dog and an extra 4 wounds per Big Knight, so a big flat durability increase across the board, plus the Iconoclast benefits with the extra AP and attack. On top of that, it also has the Bow to None Warlord trait allowing you to ignore some modifiers, and a fairly good stratagem as well with Warping Presence, allowing you to scatter some mortal wounds around the knight within 6 inches. If you do have knights throwing themselves into the enemy midst, then that's quite likely to have enough mortal wounds to be worth the CP. In general, it seems that Herbitrax just seems to win out in terms of play versus any of the other Iconoclast ones. Lucaris and Chimere kind of have underwhelming damage buffs as their main thing, and while the Fell Bonds aren't bad, it's perhaps seen as a bit more useful to make the knights slightly tougher, rather than say heaping on more melee damage. Otherwise, on the Infernal side, House Vextrix is the most commonly played. These guys are perhaps the ones to go for if you want a very shooty knight army, particularly one that's very heavy on war dogs. Each knight gets to reroll a single hit and wound whenever they shoot. Really nice on the war dog demon breath spears or even the executioner autocannons. It just means that an awful lot of big hits are going to be more likely to hit the enemy than before. They also have a 1 CP one to ignore modifiers at range, which is pretty handy, plus a small durability upgrade in favour of the Dark Mechanicum, which can stack on a few more wounds. In general, it looks like Herpetrax gets played a bit more if you're running Titanic Knights, but if you're running a War Dog Swarm, then either Herpetrax or Vextrix works very nicely. Otherwise, the other Infernal ones I think are both interesting, but maybe not quite as standout. Commentis allows you to use Infernal boosts a bit better. If you really want to lean into them, then that one could be quite fun. Plus, they've got quite a nice Warlord trait that lets you put a gun into absolute rage mode for a turn. Could make something like an Avenger Gatling Cannon very scary indeed. Korvax is Bellacor's house. They get to pick up an extra Harbinger boost once per game. Maybe the extra range on the Dread abilities could be quite handy as an early boost one. Their other options are kind of interesting though. They've got a move through wall stratagem, quite a nice one to deal with the terrain issues that knights often have, and the Rune of Darkness, a really quite nice extra toughness one, converting a big hitting damage attack to nothing every turn. There certainly are different flavours that you could play with the army, but it looks like raw damage and defense seem to win out for the most part. Other than core households, there's also the option to fill the knights as Dreadblades that get fell bonds. The main two reasons that you'd want to are if you're using the Chaos Knights as allies, or potentially making a ranged unit a bit better at shooting in a melee army, or vice versa to get a melee buff on a close combat knight in an army more dedicated to shooting. Out of the tables, there's a section of them for Iconoclast Knights or Infernal ones. I must admit, I think that the ones for Iconoclast just seem to be a bit more tempting than the Infernal ones myself, and I feel like all of these could at least be potentially interesting. Frenzied Invaders could give you exploding sixes in melee, quite nice for something like a Wardog Carnival. Worthy Offerings is quite a nice one for shooty Wardogs, plus one to hit against monsters, vehicles, and characters, plus if you kill one of them, then you get the Favour ability for any demonic favours that you have, regardless of whether or not you've met the kill tally. That seems to be quite a common pick on Wardog Executioners. I guess it could be kind of interesting on a Knight Tyrant as well. Precision Cruelty gives you extra AP and extra damage on 6s to wound, really quite nice on Executioners and maybe on any other low strength shooting knights like perhaps Wardog Moiraxes. The lightning locks on those could certainly use that. And another one that I've seen in play a little bit are Bold Tyrants as well, extra AP within 18 inches. Again, that can be quite an interesting one on the Moiraxes with the lightning locks. Getting from AP -2 to AP -3 is a bit better in an era of Armour of Contempt. I feel like for the most part they seem really quite nice for things like the Executioners and the Moiraxes. Perhaps the Frenzied Invaders could be quite a nice one for some Carnivores. I feel like it's kind of rare to see an army go too heavy on Dreadblades, but perhaps having a single unit or two of them isn't the worst. Moving on to datasheets next, and we'll start out with the Titanic Knight and then look at the War Dogs. Out of the Titanic datasheets, I feel like the best picks out of the Codex at the moment are the Knight Abominant and the Knight Desecrator. The Abominant is super tanky with its 5+ Feel No Pain spell, though ideally you want to be casting that before you're getting shot, not after. It'll really like other durability boosts to layer with that, things like the Blessing of the Dark Master or the Veil of Medringard, and it particularly gets on well with Herpetrax for that reason as well, plus it really likes the extra melee power that Iconoclast can bring. I'd use the Feel No Pain type spell, plus either the leadership debuff or the melee boosting one, and potentially you could stack some dread abilities on that with the psychic power and warlord trait if you wanted to really play with those. Otherwise, out of the non-psycho knights, I feel like the Desecrator is the other good one. The main thing that makes this one feel a bit standout is that it's so cheap. 400 points is great for a knight chassis. It's got some solid anti-tank with the laser destructor, which you can upgrade with the Diamonus. For some reason it hits on a 2+ in melee, which is a bit better than I might have expected, say compared with the Despoiler, and it also grants its reroll aura to war dogs nearby, so it makes them a bit more dangerous as well. It just feels like you get a lot more useful stuff out of it compared with the Despoiler in terms of the cost. Otherwise though, I do feel that literally any of the other Abhorrent class knights are usable, just maybe not quite as standout as those two. The Knight Rampager might be my pick for the next best perhaps, a massive melee threat that you can just hurtle towards the enemy and then maybe auto-explode if and when it dies. A very dangerous knight that your opponent's going to have to deal with, even if there is a bit of counterplay with trying to keep it out of melee with important things. Quite a nice one for the Blood Shield, plus anything that might make it tougher. The Knight Despoiler is the flexible Questoris one, that can have any combination of most of the big guns and the combat weapons, though you do pay a small premium if you double up on any weapons. Perhaps the best thing about this one is the flexibility, being able to tailor the knights to what you want to do with it. Maybe most interesting if you want a very specific weapon, like say the Avenger Gatling Cannon, and to give that the upgrades from House Commentis or something. Overall, it just feels like it maybe just has a little bit less value than the Desecrator overall. It doesn't get the base +1 to hit in combat, and the War Dog buff is just a bit less useful with the heroic intervention versus the damage boost. I don't think there's a whole load in it though. I still think that it's very usable if you want to use one of these instead. On the Forge World side of things, now that the Questor Megara has been given the Abhorrent keyword, that one's a bit more of a good option as well. Definitely far more on the expensive side of things at almost 500 points, but it does have pretty good general purpose range damage, has very nasty melee with a damage 3 sweep attack, and also gets an invulnerable save in combat as well, which is quite nice. If you just want to build up a death machine with a bunch of damage and defensive Warlord Traits and Relics, then putting it on a big expensive and murderous knight isn't the worst thing. Moving a bit further down the pecking order, and the Knight Tyrant just really doesn't feel like he quite lives up to the rest of the knights in a Chaos Knight army. Compared with the Imperial Knights, he just doesn't have anywhere near as many buffs that he really wants to use on his big guns, and in general they're quite rare includes in any sort of competitive list. Out of the two, I feel like the Castellan pattern is the better one. Fairly dangerous ranged anti-tank that will chew through other big super heavies. The Valiant pattern one just doesn't seem to be any more reliably dangerous, and is much more short ranged on a knight that isn't that great in combat. Otherwise, I feel like most of the other Forge World knights are kind of passable at the moment for their points cost. The Cerastus ones are kind of disappointed not to be classed as abhorrence. It means that they're locked out of a whole load of the demonic favours and things that are locked to certain knights, and it just means they're rarely going to be any sort of good competition for the Codex ones. Perhaps it's kind of similar for the Acastus ones. They don't seem to be any more efficient than the Dominus ones, and again are locked out of a lot of options. Overall, the Abominant and the Desecrator are my favourite, followed by the Rampager, Despoiler and Questor Megara, then the Knight Tyrant and the Forge World Knights follow on after that. On the other side of things though are the War Dogs, the Armiger Knights that got the fun new Chaos kit, and perhaps on their raw stats alone they're a bit more efficient than the big knights maybe. The main advantage of the big knights is that you can stack buffs on them to make the combined effect a bit more worth it. There's plenty of Chaos Knight armies that take almost nothing but War Dogs and allies. It does seem to be one of the most competitive ways to field Chaos Knights at the moment, so you certainly can go very heavy on them if you'd like to. Within the War Dog options, I think Games Workshop has done actually pretty well to balance them and make most of them very relevant. The Carnivore's fast and very dangerous in melee, hitting on 2s with extra attacks, very cheap for a frontline fighter, and an interesting option to take the Blood Shield. The War Dog Stalker is a nice general purpose melee one. Generally I'd be most tempted by the Demon Breath Spear and either of the combat weapons. I feel like the Slaughter Claw and Chain Talon are kind of balanced, and the Avenger Chain Cannon's also pretty interesting if you do need a bit more anti-hold work. It's a little bit weird that they differentiated the datasheets between this and the War Dog Huntsman. The only difference between that is that it doesn't get Terror Shades but can take a Melter Gun on the hull if you like. In general, I'd say that the Stalker is really the one to field them as you can take that same loadout and get the Terror Shades keyword. The only trade-off is if you desperately want that Melter Gun. Otherwise, for the ranged War Dogs, the main differences are what guns they bring. The Brigands are perhaps the most common to be spammed, with the Demon Breath Spear plus the Avenger Chain Cannon. Decent anti-horde, particularly when you add in the Diabolus Stubber and then a bit of anti-tank. The Executioners are quite handy ones to hold down home objectives with their big range though, and they're really quite good against certain units. Can be quite nice for those Dreadblade traits or the Mirror of Fates upgrade from Tzeentch. And the War Dog Moirax, I feel like the Lightning Locks or the Volkites are perhaps the most tempting at the moment. I feel like for the points cost they may be a little bit less tempting than the Brigands or the Executioners, but there's really not much in it, and they do add some very solid anti-horde. In general, it's hard to go too far wrong with War Dogs. Fast moving objectives secured, with some decent ranged and melee options, you can certainly field a whole army of them if you'd like to. Finally, before we take a look at some lists, I thought it would be interesting just to talk about allies briefly. In general, for the most part, you don't want to lose the dread abilities, so taking allies alongside de-restricted things, like say Death Guard or a whole load of demon engines or something, isn't usually optimal. Plus you lose the secondary objectives, including the really good Chaos Knight one, which usually is a bad idea. The most common allies for the Chaos Knights seem to be Demonic allies or Abaddon the Despoiler, both of which you can take with the Agents of Chaos rule so they don't break your army-wide special rules. Allies also seem to be a bit more common in War Dog lists perhaps. They've already got objectives and the battle line held down I suppose, plus they tend to have less big command point spend pre-game, so you can more justify other detachments for allies. For the demonic allies, I'd generally be most tempted to take a patrol of them. Currently Flamers of Tzeentch are almost auto-include if you're bringing demons along. Massively powerful as a datasheet, they're really efficient anti-infantry and very tough versus range. You really can't go too far wrong with them. In theory, you could double down with some big hard-to-kill threats. Bloodthirsters or Lords of Change are alright, though perhaps just a little bit less outstanding without the Demon Warlord trait in play. And I guess in theory you could use Be'lakor more as a big threat if you're not using the actual Demon Ally special rule and you're willing to sacrifice the secondaries. Otherwise the Demons can fill some interesting battlefield roles that the Knights can't do, perhaps cheap 60-point Nurglings to forward deploy or hold down objectives for a lot less points than Knights could. 70-point horror units could also do similar and hold down backfield objectives. They do come with the downside of not being able to do actions though, which is kind of big. Ideally having a few infantry units mixed in with the Chaos Knights could be quite nice, as it could allow you another good secondary in Raise the Banners, which Chaos Knights can't normally do due to being vehicles. Infantry are kind of handy to have around just in general, whether it's the Demons or Abaddon the Despoiler. It allows you a little bit better interaction with terrain in some parts of the board. You could also think about adding in more Psykers as well. The Tzeentch Witchfires are pretty brutal just in themselves, but they could also help with a bit of psychic interrogation as well, if that does make sense to do that as one of the secondaries in the matchup that you're playing. Finally, another fairly common inclusion, particularly in War Dog lists, is Abaddon the Despoiler. At 300 points is just considered pretty massive value, enormous combat stats and really hard to remove with the Mark of Tzeentch plus his damage cap. Another big threat that you can have marching up the board, allows some rerolls for nearby core knights plus a charge boost as well, and Black Legion gives him a helpful stratagem that could get him advance and charge for a turn from Red Corsairs, or potentially fights and death from Creations of Bile. At his current points cost, he's basically very tempting for any Chaos armies that he doesn't break the army-wide special rules for. Overall, at the moment, I feel like both Abaddon and the Demons are really quite viable options for Chaos Knights. A fair bunch of competitive lists seem to use them, particularly ones that are heavy in War Dogs. Finally, I thought we'd just round up by taking a look at a couple of strong Chaos Knight army lists. One with some big knights in it from Herpetrax, and one with a whole bunch of War Dogs from Vextrix. This first one's a Herpetrax one that was run by Matthew Carslake, who used it to take second at the 40k Nationals in South Africa 2022. From Best Coast pairings, it appears that it was 5 wins and 1 loss. As mentioned, Herpetrax makes the knights a lot more murderous in melee and gives them a bunch of extra wounds to work with, plus there's that warping stratagem to deal some mortal wounds out to enemies that get close. There's 3 big knights in the list, 1 Abominant and 2 Despoilers. The Abominant takes the Storm Benevolent and Winds of the Warp, making it a lot tougher, and it's a lot easier to kill one enemy unit, a pretty direct boost to this guy's melee with his mid-strength attacks. To double down on making him even tougher, he's also got Blessing of the Dark Master to turn off enemy rerolls, and also takes Infernal Quest to put all that toughness to good use, being objective secured. Then, rather than Desecrators in this list, there's a couple of Knight Despoilers with the more flexible loadouts. Generally it seems they're not quite as commonly played as the Desecrators, but having 2 in a top tournament place in the list certainly shows that they can easily do work. They can give the War Dogs some heroic intervention as well, which could be handy for objective defense. The first one takes the Rapid Fire Battle Cannon and the Teeth That Hunger, a relic chainsword that gets you an extra couple of pips of strength, and also allows you to make an additional attack. It turns this one into a bit of a melee monster when you also take into account the extra Iconoclast attack, and he has the Blood Shield as well to turn off enemy invuls for a turn. With the extra AP, that means he's pretty much going to kill a fair few models, almost no questions asked. Could perhaps be a nice one to target with that Break Their Lines 1-for-1 CP from Iconoclast. Getting +1 to hit on that guy would be brutal. It's also got Bow to None, so it's going to be ignoring modifiers at range and for movement. And both of the Despoilers pick up Havoc missiles for a little bit of ignores line of sight firepower, or just a bit more direct anti-infantry shooting. The second Despoiler picks up 2 thermal cannons instead, so basically just packing a whole ton of anti-tank there. Also taking the Havoc missile pod, and he's very tough with the Veil of Medron Guard, giving him a 4+ invul save. And he also takes the Putrid Carapace as well, that Nurgle one that makes him tougher against damage 1 weapons. I'm sure he'll be aiming to kill a 10 wound vehicle or something and get the toughness 9, making him enormously tanky for the rest of the game. Looks like he's a bit better suited to being slightly behind the other 2 knights as they stomp up the board, and just to stride around obliterating tanks. Then for some objectives and actions and things, there's a trio of War Dogs, 1 Executioner, which looks like a good one to hold down home field objectives. He can chip in with those auto cannons and also takes the Tzeentch Mirror of Fates to farm those command points. And then there's 2 War Dog Huntsmen. They've decided to be Huntsmen rather than Stalkers to make use of the Melter Guns. so they do pack a little bit more fearsome anti-tank punch up close. One of them also is the Warlord and takes the Zinch Pyrothrone with Vortex of Terrors for a further enemy leadership debuff, which works quite nicely with the Dread abilities. Overall, it looks like a pretty tanky and vicious list, a decent amount of range and combat here, though the combat is super brutal with the Iconoclast things. For the other main style of playing Chaos Knights, you can go mass War Dogs, maybe with some allies, and this list is won by a Kevin McCormick who used it to take 4th at the Lone Star Open. You can certainly also go Herpatrax for War Dog list, but this one is Vextrix, so that's 1 hit and 1 wound reroll, plus the stratagem to ignore modifiers if you need to. They do also have the option of cutting their health for various nasty buffs, including Transhuman, the extra +1 to wound, and the extra movement. I generally want to make use of those sparingly, but in the right circumstances I think they're all useful. Literally every single one of these does pack some scary firepower. There's 9 Demon Breath Spears in play here, so that's going to be a reroll to hit and wound as often as possible on those, plus 1 Executioner with some autocannons to reroll, and it's just going to mean an enormous amount of Melter Fire heading the opponent's way. In the list there's 2 sets of 3 Brigands, they also take Stubbers, and they have the Avenger Chain Cannons as well. A solid bit of volume fire on top of all the melter. Interestingly, one of them takes the Subjugator Machine Spirit, which allows this guy to fall back and still shoot, or advance and still shoot as well. Pretty handy to be extra mobile, I guess, and a bit more resilient to being locked up by enemy annoying units. Then there's another 3 copies of the same Brigands. One of them takes the Blessing of 1,000 Poxes from Nurgle. I feel like this one is probably going to be going towards the demon favoured tally for that, as if you get favoured then you get 6s to hit auto wound at range. Really quite a big deal with a flurry of light infantry shots. There's then an Executioner again with the Mirror of Fates, lightly tasked for home field objectives and command point farming all game long. There's then a little bit of melee muscle with 3 Stalkers. They all take the Demon Breath Spears, but they're set up slightly differently besides that. One takes the anti-tank Slaughter Claw and has the Warpborn Stalker one for some deep strike. One is kept cheap with just a Reaper Chain Talon, and one takes the Reaper Chain Talon and also takes the Blood Shield to turn off enemy invuls. Some fairly vicious units to countercharge the enemy if they do try and get too close to the guns, plus of course they can certainly chip into the firepower themselves with their melter. Finally, to back up the list in an allied capacity, there's Abaddon the Despoiler who does take his Warlord traits, and kind of interestingly there's also Cypher brought along as well. He's also an agent of chaos who can be slotless within a Chaos Space Marine detachment. As mentioned, Abaddon's just generally very strong and dangerous. Great melee stats, problematic to kill, and has the option of some flexible stratagems to advance and charge or fight in death, plus he can give out some rerolls to the War Dogs as they're shooting down the enemy. Cypher I haven't seen run so much, but it's kind of interesting that it's here. He messes with opponent command point regeneration, has a little bit of anti-infantry type firepower, and is kind of annoying to kill. My suspicion is that he's mainly here to be another model that can do actions like raise banners. Him and Abaddon could actually make that secondary kind of viable if it was needed, and if he happens to assassinate any infantry as he goes along doing that, then so much the better. Overall, these War Dog lists really are pretty intimidating. A whole ton of fast and durable models running around the board at high speed. They've all got objectives secured, and they put out a whole ton of firepower when they focus down one unit. As with Knights in general though, they are a bit vulnerable to Alpha Strike. If the opponent has a lot of anti-tank guns, then you're probably not going to be able to hide all of these. Could potentially be a bit risky if you go second. So with a couple of Chaos Knight lists out the way, I think we'll leave that there. Hope you've enjoyed a bit of a rundown of the faction. And of course, as always, if there's any other interesting things or tactics that you think work really well for the Knights, please let me know down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly try and make a counterpart video to this for Imperial Knights at some stage, hopefully within the next few weeks. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to quickly mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that is how I can afford to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.